You slept, you rested, you did everything you were supposed to do, and you woke up tired anyway. Not a little tired. The specific, deep, already behind tired that most people only feel after something difficult has happened. And nothing difficult happened. It is just Tuesday. There is a tiredness that the INFJ carries that does not respond to the things tiredness is supposed to respond to. Sleep helps, but incompletely. Rest helps, but temporarily. Vacation helps until the second day back, when the tiredness has simply waited and is now present again as if nothing interrupted it. Most INFJs spent to fix this tiredness through the mechanisms that the standard framework offers. More sleep, better sleep hygiene, less screen time, more movement, less caffeine, more water. Some of it helps at the margin. None of it addresses the actual source. Because the actual source of the INFJ's chronic exhaustion is not the things the standard framework was designed to address. It is something more specific, more structural, and considerably more interesting than sleep deprivation. Here is the specific thing this video is going to establish. The INFJ's baseline exhaustion is not a symptom of doing too much. It is the direct output of a nervous system that is doing something continuously, something that most people's nervous systems are not doing. That does not pause when the INFJ is resting. That does not stop when the body is still. And that consumes real metabolic resources every hour of every day, regardless of what the INFJ is doing on the surface. The tiredness is real. The source is invisible, and naming the source changes everything about what the recovery actually requires. If this channel keeps explaining the things about your experience that nothing else has explained accurately, subscribe. Okay. That is the only thing happening here. Let's get into it. 1. The background process that never stops running. Every nervous system runs background processes, automatic operations that maintain basic physiological and cognitive function without requiring conscious direction. Breathing, heartbeat regulation, basic sensory monitoring of the environment. These are the baseline background processes every human nervous system runs continuously, and they are metabolically cheap enough that the body handles them without registering them as effortful. The INFJ nervous system runs additional background processes that most people's nervous systems do not run, or run at significantly lower intensity. The most significant of these is the continuous environmental emotional monitoring operation. The INFJ's highly sensitive nerve system does not simply register the environment at the level of basic sensory input. It continuously tracks the emotional state of every person in the immediate environment, the interpersonal dynamics operating in the shared space, the tension between what people are presenting and what they are actually feeling, and the overall emotional temperature of every room the INFJ inhabits. This tracking is not a choice, it is automatic. It runs the way breathing runs, not because the INFJ decided to do it, but because the system is built to do it and does it regardless of whether doing it is currently useful or welcome. Continuous emotional monitoring has a metabolic cost, a real measurable physiological cost. The neurological resources required to run the monitoring, the sustained activation of the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, the social cognition network, are not free. They are drawn from the same finite pool of neurological resources that everything else the INFJ draws from, and they are drawn continuously. Not just when the INFJ is in a socially demanding situation, in every situation where other people are present, in every environment where emotional information is available to be tracked, which is, for most INFJs, most of their waking life. The INFJ who is sitting in a meeting, apparently doing nothing more demanding than listening, is running the full monitoring operations alongside whatever cognitive task the meeting requires. The INFJ who is having a casual lunch with a friend is running the monitoring operation alongside the conversation. The INFJ who is in a public space surrounded by strangers with no particular interaction required is running the monitoring operation across every person within sensory range. The resource consumption is continuous. The tiredness it produces accumulates across hours and days and years. And because it is invisible, because it produces no visible behavior, because it requires no apparent effort, nobody around the INFJ ever accounts for it, including often the INFJ themselves. 2. The processing debt that accumulates faster than sleep can clear it. Sleep, in the standard framework for exhaustion, functions as the clearing mechanism. The accumulated cognitive and emotional load of the day is processed and integrated during sleep, and the person wakes restored to something close to their baseline capacity. This model is accurate for most people in most circumstances. It is systematically insufficient for the INFJ. not because the INFJ's sleep is defective, but because the processing debt the INFJ accumulates sleeps across a day exceeds what a single sleep cycle can clear. But the INFJ's processing architecture runs at depth. Every significant interaction, every emotionally loaded environment, every relationship dynamic the INFJ has tracked across the day has been processed at multiple simultaneous levels. The content level, the meaning level, the pattern level, and the felt level described in earlier videos on this channel. This multi-level processing does not complete in real time. It completes in the background, during the quieter periods, and during sleep, as the nervous system integrates what was collected into a coherent, updated understanding of the relevant people, situations, and dynamics. When the processing debt is small, when the INFJ has had a relatively low input day, sleep has enough capacity to clear most of it. The INFJ wakes reasonably restored. When the processing debt is large, when the day involved multiple significant interactions, emotionally demanding environments, or sustained exposure to people whose emotional states required monitoring and absorbing, sleep clears a portion of the debt and leaves the remainder. The INFJ wakes with some of the previous day's processing still pending, and if the next day adds to the debt before the previous day's remainder has cleared, the accumulation begins. Over weeks and months of consistently high input environments, most INFJ's ordinary professional and social lives, the processing debt accumulates into a chronic backlog that no single night of sleep is clearing and that no weekend of rest is fully addressing. The tiredness the INFJ wakes with is not the tiredness of insufficient sleep. It is the weight of the uncleared backlog. The accumulated processing of days and weeks of high-depth engagement with a world that was continuously producing more input than the clearing mechanism could keep pace with. This is why the INFJ who goes on vacation and sleeps well for a week returns to ordinary life still not fully restored. The vacation cleared the surface. The chronic backlog underneath it requires something longer and more specific than a vacation to address. 3. The emotional labor that has no official status. There is a category of work the INFJ does continuously that has no official status in most frameworks for understanding tiredness and resource consumption. It does not appear on any to-do list. It is not included in any accounting of what the day demanded. It does not produce a visible output that would justify the resource cost in any standard productivity framework. And yet it is, for the INFJ, one of the most consistently expensive things they do, more expensive, on a per-hour basis, than most of the official work the day contains. The work is the management of other people's emotional states. The INFJ, who is in a meeting with someone who is anxious, is doing work, the specific work of receiving the anxiety empathically, processing it at the felt level, and maintaining their own functional stability while running the full weight of the absorbed emotional content alongside their own interior state. The INFJ, who is in a relationship with someone who is depressed, is doing work, the continuous, invisible, genuinely demanding work of being genuinely present with the depression without being consumed by it. The INFJ, who is in a family system with chronic interpersonal tension, is doing work, the ongoing monitoring, the careful navigation, the management of what they say and do in light of the full map of the emotional dynamics they are tracking at all times. None of this work appears on the official accounting. The meeting was a meeting. The relationship is a relationship. The family gathering was a family gathering. The work that happened inside all of them, the monitoring, the absorbing, the processing, the managing, is invisible in the record. An invisible work that costs real resources, produces tiredness that has no official explanation. The INFJ who is asked why they are tired after what was, by any external measure, a relatively ordinary day cannot easily answer. Because the answer requires explaining a category of work that most people have no framework for understanding. A woman described the specific frustration of this. She said the most tiring days of her life were the days that looked, from the outside, like the least demanding, the days where the official work was light and the invisible work was continuous. And she had no way to explain to the people around her why a Tuesday with no deadlines and no crises had left her unable to function by evening. The invisible work had no language. The tiredness had no justification that anyone could see. She was simply tired, again, for no apparent reason. 4. The exhaustion of being in the wrong environment for too long. There is a specific and particularly costly form of INFJ exhaustion that is neither the monitoring operation, nor the processing debt, nor the invisible emotional labor. It is the exhaustion that comes from sustained inhabitation of environments that are structurally incompatible with how the INFJ's nervous system is built to function. And for most INFJs, this form of exhaustion is the most chronic and the most difficult to address because the environments producing it are not extraordinary. They are ordinary. They are the professional environments, the social structures, the daily rhythms of an ordinary contemporary life. An ordinary contemporary life, for the INFJ, is expensive to inhabit in a way that ordinary contemporary life is not expensive for most people. The open plan office is not a neutral environment for the INFJ nervous system. It is a high stimulation, multi input, continuous exposure environment that requires the monitoring operation to run at full capacity for the entire workday. The INFJ who spends 8 hours in an open plan office has spent 8 hours running a neurological process at high intensity, one that most of their colleagues with their less sensitive nervous systems are running at a fraction of the INFJ's activation level. The tiredness that accumulates across 8 hours of this is not the tiredness of doing too much professional work. It is the tiredness of running the wrong neurological process for 8 hours in a row. The social calendar that is organized around continuous availability, the work events, the family obligations, the friend gatherings, the networking, is not a neutral schedule for the INFJ. Each event in the calendar is an episode of sustained monitoring and emotional labor on top of the INFJ's ordinary processing load. The person who experiences these events as enjoyable social activities is not wrong. For their nervous system, they may genuinely be relatively expensive. For the INFJ's nervous system, each one costs something real, and the calendar that strings them together without adequate recovery time between them is building a debt that accumulates invisibly across the week. The INFJ who lives in an environment specifically structured around the requirements of their nervous system, with adequate solitude, with meaningful rather than continuous social engagement, with the specific conditions described in earlier videos, experiences a genuinely different baseline, not the absence of tiredness, a manageable tiredness that sleep can actually clear. The difference between the two is not the INFJ's effort or attitude or willingness to push through. It is the structural match between the environment and the nervous system that inhabits it. 5. Why rest does not work and what actually does. The standard prescription for tiredness is rest. And the INFJ, who experiences the standard prescription as consistently insufficient, is often told, by themselves and by others, that they simply need more of it, more sleep, more downtime, more deliberate rest. The prescription is not wrong in the abstract. It is wrong in the specific, because the rest being prescribed is not the type of rest that addresses the sources of the INFJ's exhaustion. Passive rest, lying down, watching something, being physically still in a low demand environment, addresses physical fatigue. It does not address processing debt. The INFJ who is lying on the couch watching something is physically resting, while the processing system is still running, still integrating the day's emotional content, still working through the monitoring operations accumulated data, still completing the multi-level processing of every significant interaction the day contained. The body is still, the system is not. What actually addresses processing debt is not rest in the passive sense. It is the specific kind of active interior processing described in the dopamine detox video on this channel, the deliberate, unstructured engagement with the interior that allows the processing system to complete its work. Extended journaling, long solitary walks without audio input, the kind of unhurried time with the interior that the default mode network uses to integrate, resolve, and make coherent what was collected across the day. This is not relaxing in the conventional sense. It is more effortful than lying on a couch, but the effort produces completion, and completion is what the passive rest does not produce. What actually addresses the exhaustion from the monitoring operation is the specific input described in the nervous system video. Natural environments, sensory quiet, the particular quality of non-human sensory input that engages the processing system at low cost. Not silence in the indoor sense, which still contains the traces of human presence in the INFJ's imagination and recent memory. Natural silence, the silence of environments that have not been shaped by human and social dynamics, that carry no interpersonal emotional content for the monitoring operation to track. And what actually addresses the exhaustion of the wrong environment is, ultimately, the wrong environment. There is no rest protocol that fully compensates for years of living in structurally incompatible conditions. The rest can manage the acute symptoms. The structural solution is structural. And acknowledging this clearly, without the softening that makes it less confronting but also less useful, is the beginning of the INFJ being honest with themselves about what their tiredness actually requires. 6. What the INFJ's exhaustion has been trying to tell them. The tiredness is not random. It has a specific logic. A logic that, once understood, is one of the more precise pieces of self knowledge the INFJ can develop. The exhaustion is not uniform across all experiences. It is concentrated around specific things. And the pattern of where it concentrates is a map, an accurate, reliable, highly personalized map of what is costing the ISFJ more than it is returning. The INFJ who pays attention to where the exhaustion is heaviest is receiving specific information. The relationship that leaves them more tired than any other relationship. Not more sad, not more frustrated, just more genuinely depleted, is a relationship that is asking for more than the return justifies. The professional environment that produces exhaustion disproportionate to the actual demands of the work is an environment whose invisible costs, the monitoring, the emotional labor, the sustained performance of a version of the INFJ that fits the environment are significantly higher than the environment's visible demands suggest. Most INFJs have never read the exhaustion this way. They have treated it as a problem to be managed, something to push through, something to recover from, something to apologize for when it affects their capacity to show up the way people expect them to show up. They have not treated it as information, as a continuous, accurate, real time report on the resource cost of every significant element of their life, as a system that is telling them precisely and reliably what is too expensive relative to what it returns. The INFJ who begins to read the tiredness as information rather than as a problem makes different decisions. Not all at once, gradually as the map becomes more legible. The relationship that is always the heaviest. The decision about that relationship becomes clearer. The professional environment that consistently produces disproportionate depletion. The decision about whether to continue inhabiting it becomes less abstract. The social obligations that leave the INFJ emptier than they arrived. The decision about which of them are genuinely worth the cost becomes more possible to make honestly. The exhaustion was never just a problem. It was the most consistent and most accurate signal the INFJ's system was producing about what their life was costing them. And the INFJ who learns to read it is receiving, finally, the information their system has been trying to offer for years. 7. What it would actually feel like to not be chronically exhausted. I want to end with something most INFJs have not seriously imagined, not because the imagine is unrealistic, but because the chronic exhaustion has been present long enough that most INFJs have forgotten what its absence would feel like, or never knew. The tiredness has been the baseline for so long that the baseline has been accepted as simply how things are, how they are for everyone perhaps, how they will continue to be. The question of what it would feel like to not be chronically exhausted has not been seriously asked. It is worth asking, because the answer is not just rest, it is not the absence of tiredness. It is something more specific and more interesting than that. The INFJ who is not chronically exhausted, who is operating from genuine resource rather than from the deficit that chronic depletion produces, is a qualitatively different version of themselves. The perception that is their primary instrument operates at a precision that the depleted version cannot access. The depth of processing that characterizes their thinking produces outputs of a quality that the tired version cannot sustain. The empathy that is their most significant relational gift is available at its full capacity rather than at the reduced capacity that chronic depletion leaves. The interior, the rich, complex, endlessly active inner world that is the source of everything the INFJ values about themselves is alive and accessible in a way that the exhausted version of the INFJ has not experienced in years. This version of the INFJ is not a fantasy, it is not an idealization. It is the INFJ's nervous system operating in conditions that actually match its requirements, with adequate recovery time, with environments that are not continuously demanding the monitoring operation at full intensity, with meaningful rather than continuous social engagement, with the specific quality of solitude that allows the processing debt to be cleared rather than accumulated. These conditions are buildable, not perfectly and not immediately, but specifically, structurally, over time, through decisions that treat the exhaustion as the accurate information it is, rather than as the inconvenience to be managed that it has been treated as. The INFJ who builds toward those conditions does not just become less tired. They be more fully themselves than the chronic exhaustion has been allowing them to be. And becoming more fully themselves is finally the point of addressing the tiredness at all. 7 layers of why the INFJ is always exhausted, and why sleep, however necessary, is not the solution to a tiredness whose sources have nothing to do with insufficient rest. the monitoring operation that never stops, the processing debt that accumulates faster than sleep can clear it, the invisible if emotional labor, the wrong environment sustained too long, the rest that does not reach the actual source, the tiredness as information, and what becomes possible when the information is finally read accurately. You are not weak for being tired. You are not dramatic for how completely the tiredness affects you. You are running something expensive in conditions that were not built for it. And the solution is not to run it harder. It is to finally understand what you are running and build the conditions that let it run properly. Brainy Quiet Mind. Subscribe. Share this with someone who has slept enough and is still exhausted and has never understood why. What is the one thing in your current life that you know, if you are honest, is costing you more energy than it is returning? And what has stopped you from changing it?